There it is. Yep. Wow. So, my job here is to let you know that everything that we've been hearing about, everything that we've been talking about, all the headlines that we've been reading, the terrible stories about the border, aren't just at the border. As Gabby said when we started tonight, I've spent the last 2 years since I retired representing families and children who have been crossing into the United States and experiencing all of the things that we've been hearing about. But I don't meet them at the border. I meet them outside of Washington, D.C., in Maryland, in a rural community where they're living now, my neighbors, my friends, and they're representative of thousands of children and families who have been detained, been separated, and then they relocate. And they're in your communities, they're your neighbors, and we need to know that because the fear and the trauma that we're talking about is here. It's not just at the border. And we need to remember that. So that's my message. I want to tell you a couple stories about some of the folks that I've been meeting that have become my friends, who are my neighbors, and who I have been working to represent now. So in the last 2 years, I've represented 40 individuals, families, young people, their parents. And one of my clients, I'm going to tell you 3 stories. One of my clients, Anna, is from Venezuela. And she was escaping the oppressive government. She was trying to free herself from the abuses that she was experiencing from the gangs that are supported by the government. They are not the police, but they act like they're the police. And she'd been working in a bank. She had an education. She had a house that she lived in with her mother and her sister. And she was successful and happy, but she was also politically active. And the gangs noticed her because she was frequently leaving work to go to different demonstrations. And despite her fears, her passion for her country, her love for her country, caused her to go ahead and speak out against what she felt were oppressions that they could no longer survive as people. So one night she was beaten. Her boyfriend was beaten. He ended up in the hospital, and that's when they knew they couldn't do this anymore. Now, she was lucky. She was able to come to this country on a tourist visa because she had family here, and yet she was detained, and she was questioned, and she was humiliated. She spent 6 hours being questioned, trying to explain everything that she had documentation for. She could show the hospitalization. She could show the injuries that they had experienced. She had a police report, and yet they held her at the border, they detained her, they questioned her, and when she came here to our little community after being relocated as seeking political asylum, she sat down with me and you know, as she's tearfully recounting this story about not just the trauma that she experienced at the hands of her government, not just the trauma that she experienced at the hands of the gangs, but the trauma that she experienced at the hands of our government in our name. And we have to remember that the re-traumatization that's occurring is something that we're contributing to by not speaking up and standing up. So I'm going to move on because I want to tell you a little bit about each one, and then the Byzantine system that they're trapped in, because that's also something really important to understand. I also want to tell you about David, who was working as a military mechanic in Guatemala. He was fixing trucks. He had been working for about 8 years and living a peaceful life, trying to raise his family. He had some challenges. He had been married and divorced, but he had custody of his 2 children. And then the president of Guatemala decided that the military should begin to investigate the drug cartels. And so they charged the military with doing the work of what the police should be doing, but couldn't do because they were too corrupt. And so now the truck mechanic becomes an undercover agent. And he is ordered, to begin to investigate the drug cartel at the local bus station and other places nearby, because this was his community. He wouldn't be spotted, and plus now that was their job. He's successful, and he ends up helping them arrest 8 people who were immediately released by the police and told who was the undercover agent who had, exactly, shaking your head, exactly. So now his life is in danger. He now has heard that they've been released. He knows that they're threatening his life. He then runs into them because he's got his then 4-year-old son at a park next to the military base. And he gets pistol whipped in front of his son and ends up in the hospital for 3 days. He goes to his commanding officer and says, how can I be safe? My child witnessed this. He had to sit there crying until someone came and took us to the hospital. We can't live like this. And his commanding officer told him, there's nothing that we can do. You just can't leave the military base because there's no way that you could be safe. They know what you did, and therefore you're not safe. Interestingly enough, his commanding officer put that in writing so that when he came to the border, he had a letter from his commanding officer, notarized, stamped, that said, we can't keep him safe. He has to leave this country. And it's the large drug cartel. It covers most of the countries in the area, so he's not going to be safe in any of the neighboring countries either. He comes to the border. He gets a coyote who drops them off in the desert, helps him cross the border, drops them off in the desert, and they have no idea where they're going. So he and his now 5-year-old son are walking through the desert at night. They're hungry, they're tired, they're thirsty when the Border Patrol finds them. And he happens to have what he thought the great luck of finding a Border Patrol agent who was kind. Gave them water, gave them something to eat, asked him his story. So he has with him the letter from the commanding officer. He has his custody papers for his 5-year-old son. He has his hospital records. And yet, when they get to the Border Patrol facility, he said everything changed. Now the guy who had been kind to them, who was giving them water, is screaming at him, you're a criminal because you crossed the border. He takes away his papers. He separates him from his son. And his son was the reason he was coming to this country, to protect his child, right? And so he doesn't see his son again for 5 months. And he is desperately trying to find out where his child is. Finally, a priest comes to see him in the detention center in Texas. And he says, I'm going to kill myself if I don't find out where my child is. And this man, who is this macho man, soldier, truck mechanic, is sobbing as he's telling me this story because the trauma of having lost his child with no ability to have any knowledge about how he's doing devastated him. The priest got him connected with the Nuncia House, which I'm sure people have heard of, and they gave him a lawyer who managed to reconnect him with his child. They were brought home during the very publicized reunifications that occurred last spring. And so he says, here were all these cameras because there were 5 families that were being reunited, and I was one of them. And so my 5-year-old comes over and doesn't recognize me, and he's covered with lice, and he's covered with bruises, and he has a bite mark on his shoulder. He had been flown to a facility in New York. So they were reunited in Maryland or in Washington, D.C. And they have not gotten over it. So this 5-year-old, who is now someone that I see all the time, Alex, is starting to be a little boy again, but he can't sleep alone. He can't be by himself. He is always checking where his father is. And this is something that he's going to be living with for a long time. Again, I'm going to hold off on telling you where their cases are because I want to tell you one more story, and then I'm going to pull it all together. But the third one is Maria, who is from Mexico. And yes, from Mexico. Since I changed their names, I have to remind myself. She was 15 years old when she crossed the border. She was 9 months pregnant with the child of, she had been raped by a number of men in a gang, a drug cartel. And the reason that they came to the United States, she came with her sister, was because a few days before, she had been beaten very badly by the same group of the same gang members. But they wouldn't rape her because she was so close to having her child. So instead they raped her sister, her 12-year-old sister. And so her parents said, we can't protect you. You have to go to her sister, her aunt, who lives in Maryland. When she got to the border, she was very close to delivery. She ended up having her baby 2 or 3 days after she crossed the Rio Grande. But they didn't let her sister in, even though she was covered in bruises and told the story of her own assault and trauma. But because she was not about to give birth, they sent her 12-year-old sister back under the Return to Mexico policy. They have not heard from the sister since. So about a week afterwards, she was calling home, calling her parents, calling her sister in Maryland to say, I'm trying to figure out what to do, where can I get help? And then there's been no word since. So, of course, and that's been 6 months, so they are pretty well convinced that her sister is gone. All 3 of these families live in my little community. They have become friends of ours. I'm meeting through them many other people with very similar stories. They're not just dealing with what happened to them in their country that caused them to leave. They're not just dealing with what happened to them at the border, which causes them to be afraid, but they're also dealing with the system that is part of where we live. So we have ICE raids all the time. We have police that stop cars supposedly because a light is out, and they use that as a basis to be able to call ICE. We have police that are calling when there's a domestic violence case or some kind of low-level criminal case to make sure that ICE knows that there are people that are going to be in the courthouse that could potentially be deported. They're living with a lot of fear about what could happen to them every single day. We have established guardianship agreements so that should they not come home one day, everyone knows who's going to be able to take care of their children. We have given them as much guidance as possible about how to survive if they get separated again. But I think the main point is the border is not our only problem. And therefore, we can be doing a lot in our own communities to accept, to embrace, and to protect the people that have been traumatized in our name, on our behalf. So I was no more like than you were, Steve. But hopefully, there's music or a song to follow. And I want you to know that we are fighting every day, part of a strong legal services network. We can use interpreters, we can use lawyers, we need help. There are a lot of people that need us. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.